Good afternoon, and welcome to the West Virginia Law Review's lecture series, Beyond Politics, a discussion of healthcare in America. Today's lecture, to be delivered by Professor Eleanor Kinney of the Indiana University School of Law, serves as the first of 3 lectures examining our current healthcare system. Professor Kinney is an expert in healthcare and the law, who has dedicated much of her career to issues of health and the law. Before I begin my opening remarks, I would like to say a few thank yous. I would like to begin by thanking Andrea Johnson and Todd Bergstrom, who are the executive editors who have completely organized this event, who were instrumental in deciding that this was an important issue that we on the Law Review wanted to examine and put countless hours and lots of attention into. And if it were not for them, there would not be a lecture series. I would also like to thank Dean Joyce McConnell for all of her assistance and her help. And I would like to thank Professors Valerie Vidic for all of her assistance. And I would like to thank Professor Gerald Ashdown, who is the advisor of the Law Review. And last, I would like to thank the Edward G. Donley Memorial Lectures for making this event possible. For months, the U.S. media has been saturated with stories involving healthcare reform in America. Often, the news coverage has lacked substance and is only focused on unchecked claims and hyperbole. Interest groups and partisan politicos have dominated this debate. It is my goal that the West Virginia Law Review's lecture series rises above politics and that it rises above ideology. Instead, this lecture series will focus on social disparities in access and outcomes ingrained in our current healthcare system, the untold aspects of healthcare reform in America. That is what we are trying to expose. Each person in this room has been touched by healthcare. From the moment we are born, we are thrust into the healthcare system. As newborns, the very first place we see is the inside of the hospital, and some of the first persons to hold us are doctors and nurses. Immediately upon entering the earth, our lives and our well-being are connected to healthcare. When we get older, we are not allowed to attend elementary school until we are immunized by healthcare professionals. Once again, our lives are touched by this system. As we age, we continue to need health care, as we get sick, as we get injured. And when we face the end of life, many of us, either from age or sickness, will find ourselves once again in a hospital, just as it was when we arrived into this world. While each of us has our own personal relationship with health care, for many in America and internationally, the current system creates just as many barriers to access as it creates opportunities for patients to receive care. The lecture series is designed to discuss these barriers. It's designed to discuss the closed doors, the denial of care, and the complications the current healthcare system poses for many in this country and in this world. For example, issues pertaining to the rural poor have a great impact on the citizens of West Virginia and many in the Appalachian region. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Resources, almost 1 in 3 adults who live in rural America are living in poor health. This is linked to the fact that many rural hospitals have closed, and rural Americans often do not have transportation to go to hospitals and other communities. Throughout all 3 lectures, we will thoroughly examine issues of fairness in our current healthcare system. And today, we will examine how for-profit industry affects the human right to health. In our second lecture, to be delivered by Professor Dana Matthew, we will examine racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. And in our third and final lecture, delivered by Professor Sidney Watson, we will discuss healthcare access issues for those living in rural America. Together, these lectures should shine a light on those who are shut out of the system and should challenge our thoughts about fairness. While listening to today's lecture and the other 2 lectures in this series, I hope that you will listen to the professors with an open mind, no matter what your philosophy on how healthcare reform should be. And while each professor delivers her lecture, I urge you to ask yourself the fairness questions. Is the system fair? Are the denials or barriers to access fair? And if your answer is that the system is riddled with unfairness, you should ask yourself if we should change it. And if so, how should we? Once again, thank you for joining the West Virginia Law Review as we kick off our lecture series. There is more information on the continuing lectures in the pamphlet, and they can be accessed on our website at www.wvlawreview.wvu.edu. I invite all of you to be a part of this dialogue on healthcare in America that is taking place here today and in the future. I believe that we all have the social responsibility to examine disparities and inequities in our system, to question their validity, and to seek a fairer world than the one we inherited. Today's lecture, given by Professor Kinney, should take us one step closer toward realizing a more fair and just world. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the West Virginia University College of Law and to the first in the series of 3 lectures on the healthcare system in the United States offered by the West Virginia Law Review and supported by the Edward G. Donley Memorial Lecture Endowment. We're very privileged today to open this series with Professor Eleanor Kinney, one of the nation's leading experts on health law. She was recently featured on ABC's Good Morning America to address the question of whether medical malpractice should be part of health care reform. While that's not the topic of her talk today, we benefit from her extensive experience on health care and questions of health care access. Professor Kinney is the Hall Render Professor of Law and the founding director of the internationally recognized William S. and Christine S. Hall Center for Law and Health at the Indiana University of Law. And if you look up here, you can see the Center for Law and Health on the screen, which is part of a larger consortium at Indiana University and Purdue University. Professor Kinney's healthcare commitment is personal, deep, and long. First of all, she comes from a family of healthcare providers, which I think sometimes probably makes her a little bit of a black sheep of the family. Secondly, she graduated from law school. When she graduated from law school, she worked as an estate planning officer for Duke University Medical Center. She then earned her master's degree in public health, served as a program analyst for the United States Department of Health and Human Services, was Assistant General Counsel of the American Hospital Association, President Clinton's Task Force for Healthcare Reform member. She's on the Indiana Commission on Healthcare for the Working Poor, a member of the Executive Board of the Indiana State Department of Health, and currently chair of the Patient Safety Subcommittee of the Indiana Commission on Excellence in Healthcare. She founded the center in 1987 with the idea that it would conduct legal and empirical research on health law issues in Indiana and the nation, and would expand the curriculum and teaching of health law while providing opportunities for student participation in center-sponsored research initiatives and internships. What I've discovered is that the center has been amazingly successful, and if you get on its website, and I don't have that address. But if you get on its website, you will see the amazing work that the center has accomplished. Throughout all of her work in the center, she has also become a widely published author and respected lecturer on America's healthcare system. She's the author and co-author of numerous law review articles, book chapters, and book reviews. Today, she's going to share with us her work, Realizing the International Human Right to Health, the role of private for-profit enterprise. Join me in welcoming Professor Kinney.
I'm absolutely honored to be here today. To be giving the Edward G. Donley Memorial Lecture is really one of a major accomplishment in my life. I, too, have some thanks. I thank Dean McDonald and the staff of the Law Review who have driven me from Pittsburgh in the snow, taken me out to dinner, and worked with me. And then they have the hardest time ahead is working with me on my article. Wait for the footnotes that I'm going to dream up for this. No. At any rate, it's just a tremendous honor for me to be here and almost brings tears to my eyes. I am passionate about health care and, in particular, some of the injustices that we see in the American health care system today. About 10 years ago, I read some work on the international human right to health. which is memorialized in some UN and regional treaties. And I thought, wow, what a body of law, what a body of custom and of consensus that we can use to advance access to affordable health care for all. So I've spent a good deal of my time working on this issue, and it's my hope that I will be able to write a book about this at some point. It turned out to be a little bit more complicated than I had originally envisioned when I started my work in this field in the early part of this decade. But at any rate, I found that there's some very, very interesting issues, not the least of which are what are we going to do about the fact that for-profit enterprise is a major component of the healthcare sector, not only in the United States, but increasingly around the globe. And so to assume that we're just going to work with not-for-profit actors that have a independent mission that may be more aligned with human rights objectives, I don't think we can make that assumption. I think that making that assumption is going to lead us astray. So with that, I'm going to attempt to wrestle with how we incorporate private for-profit enterprise into the mission of realizing and fulfilling the international human right to health. This is my talk outline. You'll see right after I talk about for-profit medicine, I'm going to talk about the World Trade System, because this is becoming a very important aspect of realizing the international human right to health. And it's a very important aspect, and it deals with issues that go beyond simply making vital medicines available at a reasonable price in the third world. Increasingly, it's going to talk about the economic integration of healthcare sectors around the world. For-profit medicine. Well, I think that I'll then talk about some of the problems that we have with for-profit healthcare now, then how we can use the international human right to health to tame, if you will, or to approach access to health care and bring along the for-profit sector as an agent for good rather than a distraction from the mission. And then I'll conclude with some considerations and principles to guide reform and global integration. For-profit medicine. It goes without saying that for-profit medicine is certainly extensive, and it's here to stay. And pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers are almost all for-profit companies, and extremely profitable for-profit companies as well. And when I say extremely profitable, it's important to appreciate that they are employers, they are dividend payers, they are contributors to the community, taxpayers, so they are exporters of goods, and all of these have important social and economic benefits. Health insurers, similarly. I can get on my high horse about health insurers in a New York second, and especially after participating in a hearing in southern Indiana this summer where leaders of health insurance companies in Indiana, WellPoint and Golden Rule Insurance Company, defended the practice of post-claims underwriting. Have you heard of post-claims underwriting? This was unbelievable, where the insurance company has the practice. You buy your insurance, you supply them with all the medical records, but the insurance company doesn't really examine the medical records company and make an underwriting decision. And then when you become ill, they had thick books of codes that would identify the illnesses that they were most interested in looking at. I mean, I saw them at this hearing. And your claims will jump out, and then they will look and see if your claims if you had a pre-existing condition when you applied, and whether that you had properly had properly advised to the pre-existing condition. And then if they feel that that you have been somehow misleading, misleading meaning not knowing every fact and figure in your medical chart, then they engage in the practice of rescission, cancel not only the benefits in the future, but all the benefits in the past. It's a contract rescission rather than a termination. And that practice has the name of post-claims underwriting. I found this a totally an incredible practice. So I get on my high horse about insurance companies all the time, especially after testifying in this hearing and seeing this practice defended on the basis of protecting our other policyholders whose claims haven't popped up yet, other policyholders from expensive insurance. But yet, if you look at the profits of health insurance companies, they are a very good investment for those of us that close to retirement. They are they're very lucrative, high dividends, and I used to never pay any attention to that kind of talk when I was in law school, and I was quite the radical in law school. I won't lie. Hair to my waist, bell bottoms, the whole 9 yards. I didn't care then, but I do care now, and so I just want to make the admonition right up front that we really have to pay attention to the benefits of for-profit enterprise. Physician practices. Most of us think of physicians when we go to our physician, they're engaged in a practice, and I thought this of my wonderful primary care physician for years. Didn't care about money, just had this wonderful mom and pop practice with a bunch of, 6 other doctors, and that it obviously was not for profit. She even told me she really wasn't in it for the money. And then I find out that they are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Care Group, which is a for-profit company. So most physician practices, not on the basis of that one observation, but from additional study, most physician practices are, in fact, for-profit entities. And then we have hospitals, even not-for-profit hospitals, certainly acting like for-profit hospitals and generating revenues. So we have a for-profit world, if you will, in healthcare. And as I said, the pharmaceutical companies, say what you will, but they have brought some tremendous advances around the world. Same here with health insurance as a global business. This is very important, the health insurance as a global business, because insurance as a service, financial services, crosses state lines around the world pursuant to various world treaties. Fortune 500 custom ranking, company, industry, and revenues. And I included some of the, it would have been nice to cut off at 15 for me, because that's a round number. Well, it's not a round number, is it? 16 is actually a round number, but I'm undermining my point. I put Eli Lilly on the list because I come from Indianapolis. And Indianapolis without Eli Lilly would be a very, very different place. And similarly, without WellPoint and some of the, I don't think we have any of the other companies here. So at any rate, again, companies that make a great deal of money, companies that don't necessarily have human rights at the top of their agenda, and companies that are important contributors to communities. Physicians, we think, as I said, the physicians, not only are they for-profit enterprises, but they can travel all over the world. Similarly with nurses, WHO recently considered the human rights aspects of richer countries importing nurses from poorer countries into the richer countries to work in hospitals and the like, and leaving the poorer countries without nursing services. A very important problem. Same problem with physicians around the world. You see it in Polish physicians practicing in England. You see it with foreign physicians practicing in this country. And that is a very important human rights issue, and it's all tied up with for-profit and profit-making activity. And as the wife of a physician, I can be very sympathetic to physicians that want to have a better life for their families and get out from under perhaps oppressive regimes and the like, but it does have an impact. Medicare, medical care is big business. U.S. oncology is a lot of the cancer care in the country is being provided by this corporation. They are frank in their admission that their chemotherapy protocols are concocted with profit in mind. Obviously, not completely. I mean, they have to be effective. Pediatrics, a neonatal care company, one of the fastest growing companies in the United States of all types, and it makes money providing neonatal services to infants in the intensive care nursery, and that comes with its own set of concerns. A wonderful Forbes magazine article a couple of years ago said that they were moving into other areas of intensive hospital care because prenatal care was damaging business. You know, the damaging business, you know, if you have to go to a new business model because with this, you know, pesky, difficult prenatal care, there's not as many babies in the intensive care unit. My sympathies. But, as I said, the benefits. Let's not get too much of a bleeding heart here. Tremendous contributions from for-profit business. Surgery, I think that the technology advances of the last century are phenomenal and probably in large part due to a profit mode and the ability to make money. Paul Starr, the great sociologist, talked about the transformation of American medicine and said if government entities do not rationalize health care, maybe it will be done through corporate planning, and that may be what we're faced with. I mean, United Healthcare is in a struggle with a New York hospital chain, and they basically, and it's a huge debate. It's been written about in the New York Times, and if they want to get pre-admission screening on everybody, they want to the demands that they have in terms of managing the care of the patients are extraordinary, and their custom is that if we don't do this, if we don't identify the patients upon admissions, we can't get the discharge planning done in a way that doesn't prevent additional hospitalizations or a satisfactory outcome. This may be the wave of the future. The drawbacks, obviously, I think we have to be very mindful that these companies are not able to provide in a free market a affordable product or service, and nor are health insurers able to provide an affordable health insurance for all people. These are two very important facts. I like this slide. Which unnecessary procedures would you be referring to as all these vacuum cleaners suck up the dollars? We do have a health care system in which we pay per encounter. The event that triggers a claim or a claim for payment generally is an encounter. And so there are great incentives to encourage encounters among all types of health care providers. That, I think, is the key to reform, is changing that incentive. Basic economics, I don't read the slides out loud. That would bore you to death. But I think we are in a situation of market failure in the health care sector. And that has important consequences, in my judgment. It means that we can't have business as usual in the for-profit sector. If General Motors, well, that's a bad example. Toyota, another bad example. Ford, they didn't take any federal money. But if Ford can sell an affordable product, and I seem to have ridden in Fords all this trip, and they're tremendous cars. I was in your car this morning. If they can produce a good product and sell it at a reasonable price and that is accessible to most people, I don't care if they have fantastic dividends and if the CEO of Ford lives in a splendid style. They ought to, maybe. Maybe they deserve to. Well, that's another issue, and we get into social inequality. But there's a case to be made for that kind of profit-making if you can operate in a free competitive market. Healthcare does not operate in that market. Healthcare operates in a market in which there's tremendous public subsidy to purchase a service, Medicare, Medicaid. Not only that, there's a tremendous public subsidy in the federal income tax deductions. The tax expenditure for private employer-sponsored health insurance is just as large as Medicare and Medicaid costs, expenditures. So we're subsidizing in the United States maybe 70% of the expenditures for health care services. This is different. This is not competing effectively in a private market. And this is why I think that policymakers can expect different ways of doing business from the for-profit sector. These are the different types of market failure. These all came from a nice glossary, by the way, in The Economist magazine. But isn't health care a public good, such as national defense? I mean, we certainly wouldn't leave national defense to be left up to the private market, or we'd probably have a bunch of Blackwater guys running around. Not very appealing to me. So we come to the question, is health care special, a public good, or perhaps a right? And we get into the whole discussion of what is a right. We talk about human rights to health, and are they legal, are they really aspirational? Or are health care goods and services conventional economic commodities? Well, there's a tension here, and that tension is certainly at play in the health care sector. Well, in comes world trade policy. Aftermath of, I am going somewhere with this, don't despair. In the aftermath of World War II, and the world lay in shambles, the United Nations, the Allies created the United Nations, and the United Nations had among their projects two very important projects. One was to rationalize the economy and the trade system of the world, and they founded the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. You may have your issues with the International Monetary Fund, but it's better than chaos. And then they also established free trade as an objective and an aspiration, and set up the apparatus to achieve free trade. So we have the free trade system developed, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades developed in 1947, and now we have the World Trade Organization since 1994. The idea of these institutions is that they would provide for the free flow of goods, services, capital, and all very well and good, goods, services, and capital. And in an ideal world, you would have labor, but we haven't reached that point, and that's a problem. But you would have the free flow of goods, services, capital, and labor throughout the world, and that this would generate interdependencies and world peace. But one of the things that's important about the World Trade Agreements is that they are based on an ideological premise that everything that can be made a good or a service ought to be made a good or a service, that we ought to move away from public subsidies, and that we ought to, and that the least that government can do is the best that government can do. What's this beginning to sound like? It's sounding like a much more conservative vision of the world, and there are great concerns about, public health. There's in the World Trade Organization, we've seen World Trade Organization wrestle with public health protections as trade barriers, and they're becoming much more sensitive to that. But that is kind of the way the trade world, if you will, the ideology of free trade views public subsidies, public health protections, that they are trade barriers, and that they are in the way of realizing true free trade. Well, this is difficult. This is difficult for those who espouse a human rights approach. And these two trends, which basically came out of the same impetus to bring real order to the world after World War II, they need to be reconciled. So, we came along in 1995 with trade and services. Financial services include insurance. Services include healthcare services of professionals. They include, and of course the goods include pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So we can see that healthcare is being increasingly pulled into this world trade system, which has a very ideological tilt to the right, if you will. And it's something that is not, in the view of many, consistent with human rights approaches. NAFTA, 1994, very, very controversial. But one of, just the first step down here is the logo of the, I can't work that, but you see that guy right there is the logo for the the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, where the vision is having free trade throughout the hemisphere. NAFTA is built on these same principles: free flow of goods and services, free flow of financial insurance. Reservations are in the treaties to protect public health insurance programs, but they're grandfathered in. You can't, under NAFTA, make additional reservations at a later time. So what NAFTA has basically said, yes, governments, you can do this, but you can't, for example, decide you're going to offer a government-sponsored long-term care program in Canada. They don't have that. And expropriate the businesses of for-profit insurance companies. In fact, there's a big case before the North American Free Trade Agreement Secretariat where United States investors are trying to crack open the Medicare, the Canada's Medicare Act as a trade barrier. So we need to be very, very conscientious about the relationship of trade and health policy. And we're kind of a little behind the eight ball in terms of getting to that point in my position. I'm going to talk a little bit now what this means for Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Well, here's the U.S. healthcare sector. I don't know, I got into this analogy of cats just to make it more interesting than a table. But deer in the headlight or the cat in the headlights, 15% plus of the population is uninsured. State of affairs today. I don't even need to go through the state of affairs. It was said best by one of my former students, is now a small claims judge in Marion County. And she called me up one day. She said, I've been taking notes, and I'd just like to share them with you. And she talked about all the cases that she'd had that day that were debt-related, not necessarily brought by hospital collection agencies, but just inability to pay other bills. And she said, we are shoving people into the underclass with our health care bills in the United States. And so here's a little reflection of market failure, and I think it highlights the whole problem that we have without taking care of people under international free trade agreements. And here we have two New York Times stories where immigrants were sent back to their country of origin when they were in hospitals without insurance. The fellow on the left in front of the yellow houses was actually a resident. He woke up in Canada, he woke up in Mexico, found his way back to Canada because he was, in fact, a legal resident of the United States. The Canadian healthcare sector is not-for-profit. It's based on the Canadian healthcare statute, but before I look at that, we have the panther here of private insurance and for-profit providers clamoring to get into the Mexican healthcare system. The Canada Health Act espouses these 5 principles that will provide accessible health insurance for every Canadian, and it's quite aspirational and more than aspirational. I mean, they've done it. They really have done it. You may have to wait a little bit longer for something, but it is still there, and it's a public program, the kind of program that many feel should are basically trade barriers to people who would like money, to make money in the healthcare sector. Along comes Dr. Shauli. Dr. Shauli had access to, is an orthopedic surgeon, and he says, I have a right to make money. I have a right to treat people who will pay me. And you know, he does. He doesn't. There is an effort in Canada in some of the provinces had statutes that prohibited the for-profit insurance because they're very concerned about undermining the public plan with an overlay of for-profit insurance, and that's a crucial policy. But the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with Dr. Shauli. So we do see private providers, private insurance companies beginning to operate in Canada. Mexican healthcare sector, colorful, and before I even try to describe this, I'm just going to direct you over here to this old, to this old gray and white fat cat at the end. Ministry of Health, public providers for the uninsured. Well, I really need to update that big old guy. I don't know. I just liked him. I don't know what he really means. But Mexico is doing something really, really cool in terms of providing access to health care. They have established a program to start from the bottom up in terms of providing health care. And it's having tremendous impact. They've started with the poorest families, and they're trying to get at the people who suffer the most. They have made the attention gotten the attention. In fact, their research has been written up in leading medical journals. Julio Frank, who was the Minister of Health in Mexico and was in charge of this, is now Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health. It's really quite remarkable. And here is some of the academic attention this program has gotten, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. That's the tip of I got a tip of the iceberg there. I had to find some way to use that cool slide. And we're also seeing economic integration from across the border. A lot of people are going from the United States to Mexico to get services, and we think of everybody trying to get into our expensive hospitals to get care. You know where people in Latin America go to get care? Argentina? How many of you think Argentina? How many think Cuba? Cuba is the preferred site. Cuba! Oh, you have invited a wacko lefty here today. That can't be true. But in fact, Cuba has a very effective health care system. At any rate, also, I have had occasion to visit some of the public programs in Mexico, and they're phenomenal. This is a site where it's basically a community health center type of facility. Often these facilities don't even have floors in them, and yet they were engaged in a prevention program for diabetes that you'd be proud of anywhere in the United States. So it's just it's amazing what can be done in programs like the public health insurance program that Mexico is now launching. Concerns. The big problem here, as I said, is that if you have the combination of private insurance operating in the world and you have public programs, the private insurance companies offer or compensate physicians and providers at a more generous level. Will you have providers that are willing to serve the people who are in public programs? because it does seem that private insurance cannot work for everyone. It cannot be expanded to cover everybody. That's certainly what we're seeing with health reform today. We're not going to capture everybody, even with the proposed health reform in the Senate and House bills. We're not going to capture everybody, and we're still going to have the Medicaid program for the poor. So that's the question. You take Puerto Rico, where over half of the population is on Medicaid, but access to health care is very, very difficult for those Medicaid recipients because hospitals and providers and physicians are not willing to take Medicaid patients because of the low rate of reimbursement. So we have to get that tipping point right. A lot of money, too, that is in different health care sectors. This is the OECD countries. And what you see, that, in my judgment, causes some dislocations. Here's Bangkok. And around the world, we are seeing the construction and JCH accreditation, not accreditation, but imprimatur of quality, if you will, or of competence being bestowed on these hospitals. Hospitals being built around the world to attract people from first world countries to pay lower rates. That's great. That's going to be, you can go to Bangkok, visit the Far East and get your hip replaced all at the same time, although I don't know how much sightseeing you do after a hip replacement. This may be a good thing, and it may tame some of the rising prices in the United States and the first world. But what about those doctors in Bangkok? Are we siphoning off the best and the brightest for the hospitals that serve the first world that are located in the third world? That's a problem. And the case of cancer care and point. Cancer care is escalating at a huge amount. And the cost of the medicines are astronomical, $17,000 a month. I got these slides from the one of our hem-onc doctors at IU School of Medicine. And he comes and speaks to my class, and he very frankly says, at the public hospital that is associated with IU, we do not offer the biotechnology protocols that may be most effective in some cases. There's some drugs that they simply do not offer. Rationing? Fair? And so, of course, my students are outraged, and old Professor Kinney gets in there, just, leads them on. And he said some of these drugs would take up, consume the costs allocated for the pharmacy by March. They just are, and this is a hospital that's called one of the top 100 in the United States for a number of years, and it does an excellent job with whom it serves, but cannot provide these treatments that are available over at the Simon Cancer Center for people with insurance. And this is just going to get worse. And we see the pharmaceutical companies going into lucrative cancer drugs. And at one point, even Eli Lilly abandoned had moved out of its research and development in diabetes and made the decision to go into cancer. So it's of concern. Well, I talked about the third world, and this is a hospital I visited in Buenos Aires around 2000, and it's a stupendous hospital in terms of its facilities. And here's a hospital I visited in suburban Buenos Aires as well. Are we going to find, again, the people to work in that facility on the right when they can make a go of it in that facility on the left? And also, we're finding in some of these countries the facility on the left is too expensive for the country. So these are the major questions. Will the poor have access to effective cancer treatments? Will they have access to care at all? All right. Oh, my goodness. Here again, the international human right to health. You are familiar with the major treaties. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I will make these slides available to you. We have also many. This is the treaty that is. This is a treaty that implements the international human right to health, and Here are other UN treaties. I'm going to go through these quickly. We have regional treaties. We have a huge body of law. And as do we have a huge body of law in national constitutions of the world, many of which incorporate the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the United Nations. And so that's one way we can use this body of law to set the principles by which we will guide health reform. The real area where we can use law and human rights approaches in addressing the for-profit or taming the for-profit beast is in national legislation and regulation. These are the areas of domestic regulation: public health, social insurance, regulation of private health insurance, regulation of pharmaceuticals and medical devices. This is the model that we have in the United States. This is pretty much the model that there is in other countries of the world. And we ought to keep in mind human rights objectives and the fact that these industries, the underlying industries, operate in a context of market failure to shape national policy on health care. I won't go into this in great detail, but there is a general comment 14 that was the work of the Economic and Social Council on delineating what is the right to health. It is a tremendously important document in terms of trying to set signals, if you will, or standards by which you can assess a national health program, by which you can assess a local health program. I'll go quickly through them. They get into great details. In fact, I'm going to go through them so quickly, don't even try to read them because I want to give you a few opportunities for questions. But you can get sort of the flavor of the event. I have to put in a pitch for administrative law. I'm an administrative law professor. That's where the rubber meets the road. Putting together legislation and regulation that promotes human rights objectives and addresses some of the concerns. You see, I don't really have much here with the role of the courts. Why do you suppose that is? I didn't talk about the courts at all. Stay tuned. We'll talk about in the answers. Just want to close with these considerations. I think there's some moral considerations that we have to take into account. You know, we have to think, how much money are people really entitled to in the context of market failure, in terms of compensation for professional services, profits from the sale of goods and services. Also, from a moral perspective, what are fair practices for generating revenues and profits in a highly subsidized healthcare sector? You know, the collection practices of some healthcare providers would make your hair stand on end. We see people falling into medical bankruptcies at an alarming rate. We see non-transparent billing practices. We see the practice of rescission that I already talked about. Are those appropriate practices for a healthcare sector that comports with principles of human rights? I don't think so, and those are the kinds of practices that I would target for regulation. Here is domestic health reform ought to proceed according to Comment 14, which I went through very quickly. Or here is the reality where the patients are out in the cold down at the bottom of the screen. Principle 1 for fair treatment. I outlined 3 principles for fair treatment. These really lay out 1, 2, 3, just, you know, for-profit entities cannot compromise public health insurance programs that step in a market that has failed. They shouldn't be allowed to do that, and we should adjust our trade policy accordingly. That's basically if providers and insurance companies, for-profit entities seek the protection of NAFTA, somehow we can't let them undercut the not-for-profit healthcare sector. And maybe we need to have contributions from tax contributions. Okay, I'll say the tax word, but these companies should not be able to cherry pick and siphon off money that is needed to realize a human right to health. And then we ought to take care of immigration and make health insurance benefits portable so that we don't have situations like the deportation of people without insurance or the squalid condition that many immigrants in this country face because they do not have health insurance. So it's a tough nut to crack, but we might take a page from Hippocrates. First, do no harm. And that's what I have to say tonight. I welcome any comments for the next 5 minutes or any thoughts as why I gave such short shrift to the judiciary and the courts as an instrument of human rights enforcement and implementation. More implementation, not. Any thoughts? I overwhelmed you. Yes, sir.
When there is so much of a private benefit for those who are in the industry, the pharmaceutical companies, the hospitals, and health insurance insurers, I don't see a way out of it with those powerful lobbies, working on our government.
Well, if I had a wand, I think that it's that we really need to have election reform and financing of elections. Our lawmakers, especially at the federal level and now the state level, are too concerned about making campaign contributions. And I'm very concerned about the Supreme Court decision on corporate contributions. Already, Evan Bayh, who is a Democrat, ought to be voting for health reform, but we've got WellPoint in our state. He's up for election the next time. Now, I know Cosmopolitan wanted to do a Democrat-Republican version with Senator Scott Brown and said he was the only one in, did you all see this? That he's the only one in the Senate they wanted to see and have in the pictures. But at any rate, I digress. He is, he ought to be voting for health reform. He ought to be voting for health reform. He knows better. But can you imagine what a company could do in a Senate campaign? Any other thoughts?
Can you talk a little bit, and you and I had this conversation briefly yesterday, but how, and in some of the other countries you mentioned, Canada and Mexico, how does the development of new medical technologies, new drugs come about? And, if we have an increased public role in the financing of health care, will the lack of profits hurt new advances in medical technologies and future medical care?
Yeah, that's probably one of the toughest. I mean, to me, it's hard to see value in what insurance companies contribute, but when you look at what pharmaceutical companies contribute, that's value. I mean, the fact that testicular cancer, which was a death sentence to a young man 50 years ago, is hardly, is just a blip on the screen, is all because of advances in pharmaceuticals and basic science. I only bring up that because that discovery was made at Indiana University. But and the pharmaceutical industry will say that the United States and the insurance industry is basically financing research and development. I've heard General Counsel of Eli Lilly come over and speak in our law school and say that it's really a trade issue. I mean, why should the other developed countries of the world be able to set prices and make the drugs more affordable in those countries without really paying for research and development? That being said, we know how much money goes to marketing and direct-to-consumer marketing, but I think you're really onto something because they have made a tremendous contribution. And people have talked about having not-for-profit pharmaceutical companies. I don't know how that would work. Maybe it would, but we haven't seen them come into the market. So you're absolutely right. Why don't I have much hope for courts? I think I'll just close on this. I think we have the example of the civil rights movement in our country as one where we saw courts really move the ball in terms of constitutional protections for African American people and ultimately all of us. and we have a much better society for it. But human rights advocacies, and particularly when you're talking about positive rights, it's like the provision of health care, really need to be, they are policy issues that should be advocated through political channels. Courts are not in a good position to make the budget allocation decisions that are necessary to make sure you're operating a good society. And so, while it seems like a nice victory to get a court that says you have to do X, Y, and Z, you don't know, you really haven't the impact on the other. I would rather see us develop standards of what a good healthcare sector looks like that comports with human rights and hold the countries of the world's feet to the fire, and not let them, get away with a huge defense budget and a pitiful human healthcare budget, if you will. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I enjoyed your presentation very much, and I think you made some very valid points. As a healthcare provider, I wanted to make a couple opinionated comments, I guess. First of all, you mentioned over and over again the international right to health, and then in one of your slides you said that doesn't mean that you have a right to be healthy. I'd like to state the unpopular opinion that there's no right to health and there's no right to health care. And why do I say that? And if you ask the people in this audience, almost everybody would agree with you, raise their hand and say that there is. And if you go over to the medical school to Grand Rounds on Friday, you have an auditorium of people, everybody would agree. They'd raise their hand. But there's no, death is the absence of health. Everybody in this room is going to die. So at least one point in our lives where we're not going to be healthy, our rights are not violated. That's part of the human condition. What is health care? Is it a stethoscope, a white coat? It's the use of another person's brain. What is our legal services? These people in this room are educating themselves at great cost and personal expense to maybe help me in the future with legal issues. But I don't have any right to demand the use of your brain to provide me services unless you agree to it, unless we have a contract, unless we have a transaction. And it's the same thing with health care. I have a moral right before my Creator to be kind to to be humanistic and to try and help people. But to put into the force of law in a society the fact that there's a right to health care implies that you folks have a right to use my brain anytime you want, day or night. If you're sick and I have the skills, I better deliver whether you can pay me or not, whether we have a contract or not. So I have a problem with that, with those two issues. But saying that, I think that nowadays the way people think, the majority of people don't think that way. But that's how I think. And then the third point is that we talk about market failure and capitalism, but in fact, medical care now is socialist. I am a good socialist. My dead father, who was a GP, was one of the last free market practitioners of health care. And I won't go into any detail, but what I do day to day, I struggle with all the things you brought up, including the costs of chemotherapy drugs and administering to patients. But my practice is extremely regulated from the outside. I can't do a thing without somebody double-checking, looking over my shoulder. And I have a cadre of people to help me get things done that didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. So part of the cost is that there's an extreme amount of support personnel just to meet the regs, the rules and regs between me and the patient. And it's no longer an interpersonal relationship as far as paying for or knowing about the cost of health care. There's just a flood of outsiders. And my practice is socialist. It's at least 50% socialist. I spend lots of time trying to figure out, I can think of what to do, but I can't enact it because somebody else says I can't. You have to compromise or do something else. So thank you.
No, I think you raise extremely valid points, and I think when it comes to the regulation of medical practice, you have to go back and think, why would somebody get into the business of regulating something in that way, say the stark self-dealing rules? Those didn't come out of the imagination of somebody. They came out of an address practices among some practitioners. I think the medical profession has not all have approached medicine as you have. And there's a tremendous article in the New Yorker magazine, and his name is Anwar Gadale or something, but it's about healthcare in McAllen, Texas versus and it was just fascinating. I'll make it available through the website. On the question of the rule of law of lawyers and the fact you don't have a right to my time as a lawyer, and it isn't worth much anyway. But you do have the right to live in a society with the rule of law and democratic principles. And I think that you touch on a crucial issue: what is the content of the right to health? And I think that there's a whole set of obligations that come with being a patient, not weighing 300 pounds, not smoking, not if you are ill, taking account of your own, not expecting things to be done. So we could get into that. I could hardly get through the talk I had for in a coherent way, but you're absolutely right.
End it here. So if everybody could just give Professor Kinney a round of applause. And if you have more questions, feel free to ask Professor Kinney any of your questions outside during the reception. And thank you for attending.
Oh, thank you. This has been an honor.